In the dark world of New York's most powerful crime family, there was a man who never asked to be the leader. He was born into a life of fighting and control, and he watched as his younger brother became the most feared gangster in America. But when things changed and he was pushed into the main role, the mob gave him a nickname that would stick with him forever: the dumbest boss. This is the story of a man who always stood in the shadow of a famous person, who never thought he was smart enough, tough enough, or mean enough, but somehow still ended up running one of the biggest criminal groups in history. Tonight, we look closely at the sad, strange, and finally, very painful life of Peter Gotti. To really get who Peter Gotti was, we first have to know the world that made him. Think about the streets of East New York during the 1940s and 1950s. It was a place where being poor and wanting more crashed into each other. It was where Italian families who had just come to America and their kids had to figure out how to get by, sometimes with legal jobs and sometimes not. And it was where the Mafia, which they called our thing, gave young men with few choices both a chance and a terrible end. Before we start this amazing trip through the streets of New York and into the center of the Gambino crime family, I want to know where you are watching from right now. Are you in New York? Maybe you are far away across the ocean. Write your city and country in the comments down below. And what time is it for you? Let me know if you are watching this at 3 in the morning, like a real crime lover who stays up late, or if you are just starting your day with this tale, if you enjoy long, detailed mafia stories that help you unwind and fall asleep. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if you are liking this so far, give us a thumbs up. It really helps us make more great true crime stories for you. Now, let's jump into the life of Peter Gotti. Peter Arthur Gotti was born on October 15th, 1939, in the Bronx, New York. His parents were John Joseph Gotti S.R. and Philomena Fanny Gotti. They were hard-working Italian immigrants who had come to America and were trying to build a life during the tough times of the Great Depression. He was born in a simple apartment, one of many places the Gotti family would live as they moved around a lot. They were always trying to stay one step ahead of landlords who wanted rent money that John S.R. could not always pay. Peter was not the oldest child, and he was not the youngest either. The Gotti house would eventually have 13 children, but only 11 would grow up to be adults in the tiny apartments where the family lived. Having your own space was something no one could dream of. Kids slept 3 or 4 in one bed. Clothes that had been worn by older kids were passed down to the younger ones until they fell apart. And meals were often stretched thin to feed all the hungry mouths. John Gotti S.R. worked hard, but good fortune never seemed to stick with him. He went from one job to the next. He worked in construction. He took jobs in factories, anything he could find. But he could never keep a steady job for long. The family lived from one paycheck to the next, when there even was a paycheck. Fanny Gotti did her best to keep the house running, trying to figure out the impossible math of feeding 11 children on whatever money her husband brought home, plus whatever help the church or neighbors could give. In 1942, when Peter was only 3 years old, the family moved to East New York, Brooklyn. This area would become the place that shaped the Gotti brothers and many other young men into the monsters who would control organized crime in the second half of the 1900s. East New York in the 1940s was a neighborhood where working-class Italian and Jewish families lived. But it was also the main spot for the Gambino crime family's illegal work. The legal and illegal ways of making money were right next to each other, and often it was hard to tell them apart. For young Peter, Being a kid meant watching his father struggle and fail over and over to support his family through honest work. It meant seeing the men in the area who had money, the guys who ran the betting games, the ones who lent money at high interest, the men connected to the crime family, and it meant understanding that there was another way, a way that did not involve breaking your back for very little money. It meant learning at a young age that the rules of normal society were not made for people like him. That success did not come from following the rules, but from figuring out which rules could be ignored or broken. Among the Gotti kids, certain traits showed up early. John, who was born in 1940 and was just 1 year younger than Peter, had a natural charm and bravery that pulled other kids to him like bugs to a light. Even as a little boy, John was the leader, the one other children followed, the one who seemed meant for something bigger than the small world of their poor life. Jean, Richard, and Vincent, the other Gotti boys who lived to be adults, each had their own way of acting, their own methods for getting through life. But Peter was different. He was quieter, more shy, and not as quick to fight as his brothers. He seemed okay with staying in the background. Where John grabbed everyone's attention, Peter stayed away from it. Where John would be the first to throw a punch in a street fight, Peter would try to talk things out first. Teachers who had the Gotti boys in their classes saw the difference. John was trouble, always in the principal's office, always testing the limits. Peter was just average. He got C's in school, never caused any problems, and never really stood out. This did not mean Peter was weak. He could fight when he had to. And growing up as a Gotti in East New York meant you had to fight a lot. But there was something in his nature that made him want to stay away from arguments instead of starting them. His mother saw this, and sometimes she would wonder out loud how her quietest son had ended up in a family with such loud personalities. His father saw it too, though he did not say much about it. And John, even when he was a young teenager, seemed to know without being told that his older brother would always be the one to follow. Not to lead, the streets of East New York taught lessons that no school ever could. By the early 1950s, when Peter was becoming a teenager, the neighborhood was completely run by the Gambino crime family. At that time, it was led by Albert Anastasia, who was known as the main killer for a group called Murder, Inc. The family's power touched everything. The trucking companies, the building sites, the union for dock workers, the illegal betting games, the loan shark operations, and many other businesses, both legal and illegal. For young Italian-American men who wanted to get ahead, but did not have many good legal options, the road into organized crime was well worn and easy to see. You started as a kid doing small jobs for the local gangsters, delivering packages, passing messages, keeping watch. If you showed you could be trusted and you kept your mouth shut, you moved on to more serious work, collecting debts, driving stolen cars, maybe taking part in robberies or truck hijackings. If you were skilled and lucky, you eventually got made. That meant you were officially brought into the family as a full member of the Mafia. The Gotti brothers followed this path, but they did it at different speeds and with different amounts of success. John quit school at 16 and jumped completely into life on the streets. By the time he was in his late teens, people already thought of him as someone to keep an eye on. He was a young, tough guy who had brains behind his boldness. He joined a street gang that would later turn into a serious criminal group, and he got the attention of Carmine and Daniel Fatico, two brothers who ran a crew in the Gambino family. Peter's move into this life was slower and more hesitant. He barely finished high school and actually kept real jobs for several years. In 1960, When he was 21, he married Catherine, the girl he had loved since they were kids. They moved into a small apartment, and Peter got a job with the New York City Sanitation Department, the agency that picks up trash for a young man from his background. This was actually a pretty good job. Steady work, benefits from a union, and a pension when he retired. His mother was proud. His father was relieved. Peter seemed like the one Gotti boy who might be able to stay away from the pull of the streets. But that pull was too strong. In that same year, he got married. 1960, Peter also became someone connected to the Gambino crime family. The old records do not say exactly how this happened, but the most likely reason is simple. His brothers, especially John, were already deeply involved, and family ties meant everything in the mob. If your brother was trusted, you were trusted. If your brother was making money, there was money for you too. For Peter, this was the start of a double life that would last for almost 20 years. During the day, he was a city worker, a regular guy riding on the garbage trucks through Brooklyn neighborhoods, doing honest work for an honest paycheck, at night and on weekends. He was connected to the Gambino family, doing whatever jobs they asked him to do. In the early years, these were small things. Driving someone somewhere, keeping watch outside a social club, picking up packages and dropping them off. Nothing that would get the police seriously interested in him. Nothing that would mean a long prison sentence if he got caught. During the 1960s, while Peter was living this double life, John's reputation kept getting bigger. In 1962, John married Victoria DiGiorgio, and they started having children. Unlike Peter, John did not have a regular job to fall back on. He was completely committed to the criminal life. He worked for the Fatico brothers and built a name for himself as someone who could be counted on. When needed, someone who was ruthless. In 1968, John and his crew were part of a famous event. They kidnapped and probably murdered a man named James McBratney, who had killed a nephew of the Gambino boss, Carlo Gambino. John agreed to a deal and served 3 years in prison. But this event actually made his reputation even stronger. He had done what needed to be done, accepted the punishment, and kept quiet. These were the things the mob valued more than anything else. When John got out of prison in 1972, he was ready to move up fast. Carlo Gambino himself had noticed the young guy who had gotten revenge for his nephew's death. In 1973, John was officially made. He was brought in as a full member of the Gambino family in a secret ceremony. He was 33 years old, which people thought was pretty young for such an honor. Peter, at the same time, was 34 and still just an associate. He was still working his sanitation job, still doing small tasks for the family. The difference between the brothers was becoming impossible to ignore. While John was building a name as a rising star in the organization, Peter was seen as John Gotti's brother. That was his main identity in the mob. A useful guy to have around because of his family connection, but not someone who stood out on his own. In 1979, something happened that would later become a symbol of Peter Gotti's whole criminal life. No one realized it at the time, but Peter, now 40 years old and still working his sanitation route, fell off a garbage truck and hit his head on the street. The injury was bad enough that he had to go to the hospital, and it left him with ongoing problems from the concussion that would bother him for the rest of his life. More importantly for his path in the mob, this injury let him apply for a disability pension from the sanitation department. Peter took the disability retirement and left his city job after almost 19 years of work. In theory, this let him collect a pension while putting more of his energy into his criminal activities. In reality, it became a joke inside the Gambino family. The story of Peter falling off a garbage truck and hitting his head was told over and over at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, the storefront in Queens that was John Gotti's main spot. The jokes had a mean edge to them. They suggested that Peter had never been the smartest guy around, and that hitting his head had only made things worse. Whether these jokes were fair is something people can argue about. Post-concussion syndrome is a real medical problem that can cause constant headaches, dizziness, trouble focusing, and memory issues. But in the super tough world of the mob, showing any weakness was dangerous. Peter's injury became part of who he was. Not just John Gotti's brother, but John Gotti's kind of slow brother who had fallen off a garbage truck. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Gambino family was going through huge changes. Carlo Gambino died in 1976, and the man who took over, Paul Castellano, became the new boss of the family. Castellano was a different kind of mob leader. He was more like a businessman than a street thug. He was more interested in white-collar crime and controlling construction businesses than in the rough work of hijacking and robbery. This created tension inside the family between the older group of street criminals and Castellano's more corporate style. John Gotti was firmly on the side of the street criminals. By 1980, he had been promoted to capo, which meant he was a captain in charge of his own crew. He took over from Carmen Fatico, who had retired. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club became his base, and his crew became one of the busiest and most profitable in the family. They ran gambling operations, loan sharking, hijackings, and many other illegal activities throughout Queens and Brooklyn. John was making serious money. He drove expensive cars, wore expensive suits, and built the flashy public image that would later make him famous as the Dapper Don. Peter, now in his mid-40s, was part of John's crew, but he had a much smaller role. His main job seemed to be taking care of the Bergen Club, making sure it was clean, that there was coffee made, that everything was ready for meetings. He also served as a driver for John and their brother Gene, who was also moving up in the ranks. These were important jobs in their own way. A driver hears everything, knows everyone's business, and can be trusted with secret information. But they were not the kind of jobs that built a reputation or showed that someone had the skills to be a leader. In 1985, everything changed. John Gotti was frustrated with Paul Castellano's leadership and was afraid that Castellano was about to have him killed. So he came up with a very bold plan. On December 16, 1985, as Castellano was arriving at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan for a dinner meeting, he was shot and killed on the sidewalk. It was one of the most daring mob hits in New York history. 3 weeks later, John Gotti became the new boss of the Gambino family. At 45 years old, John Gotti had reached the very top of the American Mafia. He was the youngest boss of a New York crime family in many years, and he brought an aggressive, high-profile style that was totally different from the bosses before him. Where previous bosses had tried to stay out of the public eye, John welcomed media attention. He would hold court outside the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, greeting people from the neighborhood and reporters with the same friendliness. His expensive suits and carefully styled look earned him the nickname Dapper Don. His repeated not guilty verdicts in the late 1980s earned him another nickname, Teflon Don, because it seemed like no charges could stick to him. The media loved John Gotti. Here was a real-life gangster who looked and acted like someone from a movie. He was handsome. He talked in a rough but confident way, and he was proud of who he was. Articles about him appeared in newspapers and magazines. TV news shows did stories about him. He became, in a strange way, famous. Maybe the last American gangster to get that kind of public attention. In 1988, at the age of 49, Peter Gotti was finally made. He was officially brought in as a full member of the Gambino crime family. He had been an associate for 28 years, which is an incredibly long time. Most men who are going to be made were brought in during their 20s or 30s. To wait until almost 50 suggested one of two things. Either you had done something to make the family hesitate about fully trusting you, or you simply were not considered important enough to bother making until your brother became boss and could pull strings for you. The truth was probably the second one, with John as boss and Jean also moving into a position of power in the family. Having Peter stay just an associate was starting to look weird. Family loyalty was important, and John wanted his brothers around him in official roles. So Peter was brought in at a ceremony that bonded him for life to the Gambino family and to the Mafia Code of Silence. That code said you could never cooperate with the police, and if you did, you could be killed. The next year, 1989, John promoted Peter to capo. He gave him his own crew to run at age 50. Peter was finally a captain in the mob. This was a big step up very late in his career. But everyone in the family understood the truth. Peter got the position because he was John's brother, not because he had shown amazing criminal skill or leadership ability. The men assigned to Peter's crew were mostly low-level earners, and Peter's responsibilities were pretty small compared to other capos, who ran big money-making operations and controlled large areas. What Peter did have was access. As John's brother, he could deliver messages from the boss without anyone questioning if the message was real. He could represent the boss at meetings and events. He could act as a go-between when John needed to talk to capos or soldiers without doing it directly. In the carefully organized structure of the mob, these roles had value, even if they did not have the respect that came with running major criminal operations. But there were whispers, always whispers. Other mobsters questioned Peter's intelligence, his abilities, whether he deserved to be a captain. The old jokes about the garbage truck accident started going around again. Some people wondered out loud how he had managed to survive almost 30 years as an associate without getting killed or sent to prison. Was it luck, or had he just been given such small jobs that there was no chance for him to mess up badly enough to matter? John Gotti himself reportedly had doubts about his brother's skills. According to later stories from people who told the government about the mob, John said privately that he did not think Peter could ever be boss material. Peter's loyalty was never in question. Peter could be trusted, absolutely. But did Peter have the brains, the strategic thinking, the toughness, and the commanding presence needed to run a major criminal group? John's private answer was no. This judgment was not entirely fair to Peter. By all accounts, he did okay at the jobs he was given. He paid attention to details. He was responsible. And he really cared about the well-being of the family and its members. But in the mob, as in many groups, being good at one level does not automatically mean you will be good at the next level. Being a good soldier does not make you a good captain. Being a good captain does not make you a good boss. And Peter had skipped over much of the normal path, jumping from associate to captain without the years of experience and reputation building that usually came in between. The 1990s started with John Gotti at the very top of his power and fame, but the police were closing in. The FBI had made it their top goal to destroy the Gambino family's leadership, and they came up with a plan specifically designed to bring down John Gotti. They hid listening devices in the Ravenite social club and in the apartment above it. Where John held meetings, they found people inside the organization who were willing to become informants. Most damaging of all, they convinced Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, John's underboss and right-hand man, to become a government witness. On December 11, 1990, John Gotti was arrested on charges of murder, planning murder, loan sharking, racketeering, blocking justice, illegal gambling, and tax evasion. The evidence against him was overwhelming, especially with Gravano testifying in detail about the Sparks Steakhouse killing and many other crimes. The trial started in January 1992 and was a huge media event. For the first time, Americans heard detailed testimony about how the modern mafia actually worked, told by someone who had been one of its top leaders. On April 2, 1992, after less than 14 hours of discussion, the jury found John Gotti guilty on all charges. 2 months later, on June 23, 1992, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of ever getting out. At 51 years old, John Gotti's time as boss had lasted only 6.5 years, and he would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. It was a maximum security prison where he would be kept in almost complete isolation. But John Gotti was not ready to give up his title just because he was in prison. He made it clear he was still the boss of the Gambino family. This was almost unheard of in the past. Mob bosses who went to prison usually either stepped down or were pushed out by younger guys who wanted power. But John's personality was so strong, and his brothers and loyal followers were so committed, that the family accepted his continued leadership, even though he was locked away for life. The plan was simple. John Gotti Jr., John's oldest son, would serve as acting boss. He would handle the day-to-day running of the family while getting advice from his father through prison visits and messages. Peter's job was to act as a messenger between father and son, helping to pass along instructions and information. Gene Gotti would provide extra support, though he too would soon go to prison on his own charges. For Peter, now in his early 50s, this was a comfortable role. He was not in charge, not making the big decisions, not the main target for the police. He was doing what he had always done, serving his family, following John's instructions, staying loyal. He could do this. This made sense to him. But the FBI's fight against the Gambino family was not over. During the 1990s, they kept arresting and charging family members at every level. The RICO law gave prosecutors powerful tools to take apart organized crime by targeting whole organizations instead of just individual criminals. They could prove that the Gambino family existed, that it was involved in an ongoing pattern of crime, and that anyone who was a member and took part in that pattern was guilty, no matter what specific crimes they had committed. John Gotti Jr. tried to keep control, but it was a losing battle. He was arrested many times during the 1990s on different charges. Each time he either beat the case or served fairly short sentences, but the pressure never stopped. Being acting boss of a major crime family while under constant FBI surveillance was almost impossible. Every phone call might be tapped. Every meeting might be photographed. Every associate might be a government informant. In 1999, John Gotti Jr. was arrested again, this time on racketeering charges that would lead to a long prison sentence. With Jr. off the streets, John Siar had a problem. He needed someone to lead the family, someone he could trust completely, someone who would follow his orders, even though he was locked in a federal supermax prison. The logical choice in John's mind was his brother Peter. Peter did not want the job. According to later accounts from people close to the family, Peter argued against it. He knew his limits. He knew what people said about him. He knew he did not have his brother's charm or smart thinking. He was 59 years old, had serious health problems, including being blind in one eye from glaucoma, and had never wanted to be a leader. Why not pick one of the more skilled capos? Why not someone younger and sharper? But John insisted, and in the Gotti family, what John wanted, John got. The reasoning was simple. Peter was family, and family was everything. Peter would never betray him, would never try to take real power for himself, would never make deals with the government. Peter would follow orders, and that was what John needed most. Not brilliance or strategic genius, but loyalty and obedience without question. So in late 1999, Peter Gotti became the acting boss of the Gambino crime family. The official message went out to the family's different crews and groups. Peter would be in charge, but everyone understood he was really just a front for John, who remained the real power even from his prison cell. This arrangement satisfied John's need to keep control, but it satisfied almost no one else. The mob is not a democracy. Leaders are not chosen by vote, and bosses do not need to win popularity contests. But there is a rough kind of fairness to it. Men who show they are skilled, smart, and ruthless move up. Men who prove themselves weak, stupid, or unreliable are pushed aside or killed. And men who are given positions they clearly do not deserve lose the respect of the soldiers and capos who are supposed to follow them. Peter Gotti's appointment as acting boss was met with disbelief and barely hidden mockery throughout the Gambino family and the wider mafia world. The jokes started immediately. The dumbest Don became his nickname. Sometimes people said it to his face. More often they said it behind his back. People compared him to earlier Gambino bosses, Carlo Gambino, who had ruled with quiet intelligence and brilliant strategy for 20 years. Paul Castellano, who had built a fortune through fancy white-collar crimes. Even John Gotti, who, whatever his faults, had shown real leadership ability and a commanding presence. And now Peter. One incident showed the general feeling perfectly. Michael DiLeonardo, nicknamed Mikey Scars, was a powerful and respected capo in the Gambino family. When Peter became acting boss, John tried to appoint DiLeonardo as consigliere, which is the counselor to the boss, and usually the third most powerful position in a crime family. DiLeonardo refused. He said flat out that Peter did not have the skills and management ability needed to be boss, and he did not want to be part of what he clearly saw as a failing leadership. For a capo to refuse such a high position was almost unheard of. And the fact that he did, it told everyone in the organization exactly what he thought of Peter's leadership. Other members of the family were more polite in public, but just as dismissive in private. The surveillance tapes and wiretaps from this period, which were later played in court, caught mobsters openly questioning Peter's intelligence and qualifications. How is this guy the boss? One soldier asked another. He has no idea what he's doing, another observed. Johnny must be losing his mind in prison, knowing his brother is running things into the ground. But Peter did have some advantages. First and most importantly, he had the power of the Gotti name behind him. No matter how much individual mobsters might question his abilities, they could not question that he had the right to be boss. John had appointed him, and John was still, in the eyes of most family members, the true boss. Going against Peter meant going against John, and no one wanted to do that second. Peter had loyal supporters. Arnold Zeke Squitieri and John Jackie Nose D'Amico, two experienced capos who had been close to John Gotti for years, promised to support Peter. They understood that Peter was in over his head. But they also understood how important it was to keep the family stable. So they gave him guidance, made many of the real decisions, and generally propped up Peter's leadership while he served as the public face. Third, Peter genuinely cared about the family and its members. He was not hungry for power or trying to use his position to make himself more important. He was trying, within his limits, to keep the organization running. He held meetings, settled arguments, made sure money was shared properly, and kept up the traditions that gave the family its identity. It was not brilliant leadership, but it was okay caretaking during a hard time. The structure of the Gambino family during Peter's time in charge was complicated. On paper, Peter was the boss. In reality, John Gotti was still making the big decisions from prison, with Peter acting as his representative. But because talking to John was difficult and dangerous, prison visits were watched. Phone calls were recorded, letters were read. Peter had a fair amount of freedom in day-to-day choices, and because Peter knew his limits, he relied heavily on his trusted capos to actually run things. It was leadership by group, with Peter acting as the chairperson who could make final decisions when needed, but who usually let others with more experience make the calls. For a legal business or organization, this might have worked out pretty well. But for a criminal group under constant pressure from the police, it was a disaster waiting to happen. In the early 2000s, as Peter Gotti struggled to keep control of the Gambino family, the organization's influence reached into a surprising place, Hollywood. This would eventually become one of the strangest and most damaging parts of Peter's time as boss. It involved the famous action movie star, an ambitious movie producer, and a clumsy plan to get money through threats. This scheme would play a big part in Peter's later trial. The story started with Julius Nasso, a movie producer who had built a successful partnership with action star Steven Seagal in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Together, they had made a series of profitable action movies, including Marked for Death in 1990, Out for Justice in 1991, and most notably Under Siege in 1992, which became Seagal's biggest hit. The partnership had made both men wealthy, but like many Hollywood relationships, it eventually turned sour. By the late 1990s, Seagal wanted out of his partnership with Nasso. The exact reasons are still argued about. Seagal later said he found out Nasso had ties to organized crime and wanted to get away from him. Nasso claimed Seagal just wanted to keep a bigger share of the money from future movies. Whatever the reason, Seagal ended the partnership, leaving Nasso feeling cheated out of money he believed he was owed. Nasso, who supposedly had connections to the Gambino family through his brother-in-law, turned to the mob for help collecting what he saw as his debt. This was not unusual. Throughout the mob's history, people have asked organized crime figures to help settle arguments, collect debts, and enforce agreements that could not be resolved through normal legal channels. What happened next, however, was both typical of mob operations and incredibly stupid given how closely the police were watching the Gambino family. The family gave the job to Anthony "Sonny" Ciccone and Primo Casarino, two Gambino members who had experience in threatening people for money. The plan was simple: confront Seagal, make it clear that refusing to pay would have bad results, and collect $150,000 for every movie Seagal made from then on. That would add up to about $3 million over several movies. It was a classic mob shakedown, the kind of thing Gambino members had been doing for years in businesses from construction to garbage collection to entertainment. In January 2001, the plan was put into action. Seagal was picked up in a limousine and told they were going to a meeting. Then he watched as they switched cars. This is a classic intimidation trick, meant to make someone feel controlled and scared. He was driven to a restaurant in Brooklyn, where Ciccone and Casarino were waiting. The meeting has been described in different ways, depending on who is telling the story. But the main facts are clear. Ciccone did most of the talking, making it clear that Seagal owed money and that this was not a negotiation. According to later testimony, Ciccone told Seagal, "Look at me when I talk to you. We are proud people." The meaning was obvious. This was not a business talk between equals, but a demand from people who could and would hurt him if he did not go along. Seagal, for all his tough guy movie roles and claimed martial arts skills, was terrified. He later testified that he brought a handgun to the meeting because he feared for his life. In the end, he agreed to the demands. Over the following months, he paid about $700,000 to the mobsters. That money was then shared up the chain of command in the Gambino family. What does this have to do with Peter Gotti? He was the boss, and in the mob structure, the boss gets a piece of everything. According to prosecutors, Peter received regular cash payments from Ciccone that came directly from the Seagal shakedown. Whether Peter knew all the details of where the money came from, or just accepted it as general payment from a member of the family, is not clear. But in the eyes of federal law, it did not matter. As boss, he was responsible for the actions of family members, and accepting money from a criminal enterprise made him part of that enterprise. The Seagal shakedown scheme might have continued forever if not for one important fact. The FBI was watching. They had extensive surveillance on key Gambino figures, including wiretaps that caught mobsters joking about squeezing the action star for money. In one recorded conversation, mobsters laughed about how Seagal had played tough guys on screen, but had been surprisingly easy to push around in real life. These recordings, along with Seagal eventually agreeing to help the authorities, would become the basis for major charges against Peter and other Gambino leaders. The incident showed everything that was wrong with Peter's leadership. The Seagal shakedown was exactly the kind of high-profile, attention-grabbing crime that the family should have avoided during a time of intense police scrutiny. A smart boss would have realized that threatening a famous movie star would definitely attract federal attention and was not worth the fairly small amount of money involved. But Peter either did not understand this risk, did not have enough control over his men to stop them from doing it, or simply failed to use the kind of smart judgment that effective leadership requires. The year 2002 was devastating for Peter Gotti and the Gambino family. It started with increasing pressure from federal law enforcement, continued with the death of John Gotti, and ended with Peter facing charges that would effectively end his criminal career and his freedom. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died in the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. The official cause of death was throat cancer, which he had been fighting for years. His last months were reportedly painful and hard. The once stylish gangster was reduced to a shadow of his former self by the disease and the harsh conditions of his imprisonment. For Peter, his brother's death was personally heartbreaking. Whatever their differences, whatever the complications of their relationship, John had been his little brother, his protector, his boss, and in many ways the main focus of his adult life. Peter had spent years serving John, following John's orders, living in John's shadow. Now John was gone, and Peter was truly on his own for the first time in his criminal career. But Peter had little time to grieve. Just days before John's death, on June 4th, 2002, Peter was charged in federal court with racketeering as part of what prosecutors called waterfront investigation. The charges were the result of years of investigation into the Gambino family's control of the Brooklyn and Staten Island waterfronts, a profitable area that the family had ruled for decades. The charges against Peter were many: racketeering, extortion, money laundering, conspiracy, and multiple counts related to the family's criminal activities on the docks and in related industries. The charges also included counts related to the Steven Seagal shakedown, which prosecutors pointed to as an example of the family's reach into legal entertainment businesses. Peter was charged along with several other family members, including Richard V. Gotti and Richard G. Gotti, nephews who were also involved in family operations. The timing of the charges was almost certainly on purpose. Federal prosecutors knew that John Gotti was dying, and they wanted to move against the family's leadership before there could be any fight over who would take over, or any reorganization. By charging Peter just before John's death, they made sure to cause maximum disruption to the family structure at a very weak moment. Peter was arrested and held on bail that he could not afford. In the past, when the Gambino family was at the height of its power, the organization would have gathered around an arrested boss, providing top-notch lawyers and financial help for his family. But by 2002, things were different. The family was broken, weakened by years of prosecutions. Many of the richest and most skilled members were in prison or had switched sides to become government witnesses. The younger generation was less committed to the old codes of loyalty and silence. Peter found himself mostly abandoned. The family gave very little financial help for his legal defense. No one was organizing fundraisers or making sure his family was taken care of. The contrast with how the family had rallied around John during his legal troubles was sharp and painful. Peter, who had given his whole adult life to serving the family and his brother, was discovering that loyalty in the mob often flows in only one direction. The media coverage was extensive, but had a very different tone than the coverage of John Gotti's trials in the early 1990s, where John had been shown as a charming, dangerous figure, a real-life godfather. Peter was shown as a bumbling has-been, the dumbest don, who had somehow stumbled into leading a once great criminal organization that was now falling apart. Newspaper headlines made fun of him. Court TV coverage emphasized his apparent lack of skill. Even the prosecutors seemed almost dismissive, treating Peter not as a dangerous criminal mastermind, but as a placeholder who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. For Peter, now 62 years old, blind in one eye, suffering from many health problems including thyroid issues, sciatica, emphysema, rheumatoid arthritis, post-concussion syndrome, and depression, the thought of a trial and a possible long prison sentence was terrifying. He had spent most of his life avoiding exactly this situation, keeping his role in the family low-key enough that he would not become a main target for prosecutors. But now, having been pushed into the boss position, he was the biggest target of all. His lawyers looked into the possibility of a plea deal, but the prosecutors were not interested in offering anything that would let Peter avoid significant prison time. They wanted convictions at trial. They wanted to show the public and the mob that even a Gotti could not escape justice. The trial was scheduled for early 2003. On February 3, 2003, Peter Gotti's trial began in Brooklyn Federal Court. From the very first day, it was clear this would be a spectacle unlike most mob trials. The reason was simple. Steven Seagal was scheduled to testify, and the thought of a famous action movie star taking the stand against mobsters brought media attention that turned the courthouse into a circus. Seagal arrived for his testimony wearing an Asian-style jacket and jeans, his long hair tied back, looking every bit the Hollywood eccentric. The visual contrast with the prosecutors in their conservative suits and the defendants in their courtroom clothes was striking. Here was a man who had built his career playing characters who beat up bad guys. Now he was nervously testifying about being intimidated and shaken down by actual criminals. His testimony was both fascinating and ridiculous. Segal described the meeting with Chacon and Casarino, painting a picture of barely hidden threats and his own fear. "I'm a movie star," he testified. "If you want to keep making movies, you don't want to start a war with these people." He admitted to paying the $700,000 and explained that he had helped the FBI because he was afraid for his life. The defense lawyers went after him hard. They showed Segal as a liar and a coward, someone who was trying to avoid admitting that he had willingly paid money he owed and then falsely claimed it was a shakedown. At one point, defense lawyer Richard Grabach asked Segal if it was true that he had hired a former CIA agent to kill someone. Segal's response became one of the most memorable moments of the trial. "I'm not on trial here. This is insane." The exchange highlighted the strange nature of the proceedings. Here was a federal racketeering trial, usually one of the most serious types of criminal cases, and it had turned into accusations about a movie star's personal life and behavior. The jury, the judge, the press, and the defendants all seemed to recognize the absurdity, even as they played their parts in the drama. But beyond the Segal testimony, the prosecution built a careful case against Peter. They showed surveillance photos of various mobsters meeting with Peter, showing him respect, delivering what were clearly payment tributes. They played wiretapped conversations in which Peter discussed family business, gave orders, and accepted reports from his men. They brought in witnesses who testified about the Gambino family structure and Peter's role at the top of it. Perhaps most damaging were the witnesses who testified about Peter's skill, or lack of it. Michael De Leonardo, who had refused to serve as Peter's consigliere and had since become a government cooperator, testified at length. He described Peter as someone who lacked the skills and management ability necessary to lead a major criminal group. He testified that he had refused the consigliere position specifically because he did not believe Peter could effectively lead and did not want to be part of what he saw as certain failure. Other cooperating witnesses repeated these themes. They described a family in chaos under Peter's leadership, with capos making their own decisions, communication breaking down, and the kind of coordination and planning that had marked earlier leadership completely missing. They showed Peter as a figurehead, someone who held the title but did not really exercise power, who was manipulated by more skilled subordinates, and who stayed in the position only because of his last name. Peter's defense team had a hard job. They could not deny that Peter was part of the Gambino family, or that he had held leadership positions. The evidence of that was overwhelming. Instead, they used two strategies. First, they tried to make Peter's role seem smaller, arguing that he was a fairly minor figure who had been pushed into a position he did not want and never really held effectively. Second, and more remarkably, they basically argued that Peter was too incompetent to be guilty of the serious crimes listed in the charges. This defense by incompetence was extraordinary. Defense lawyer Gerald Sharble basically told the jury that yes, Peter was part of the Gambino family, but he was so clearly incapable of actually leading it that he could not be held responsible for the organization's crimes in the way a true boss would be. It was an admission wrapped in an insult. We admit our client is the dumbest Don, and that's why you should find him not guilty of being the boss. The strategy failed. After discussing the case for parts of 3 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges on March 17, 2003. Peter showed little emotion as the verdicts were read, though those who knew him said he seemed to shrink into himself, the weight of the convictions visibly pressing down on him. As he was led from the courtroom back to the holding cells, he reportedly said to one of his lawyers, "They got me. It's easy to convict a Gotti. All you have to have is the name." There was truth in this bitter observation. A Gotti name, which had once been a source of power and protection, had become a problem. Federal prosecutors had built their careers by prosecuting Gotti family members. Juries had been convinced through years of media coverage that the Gottis represented everything wrong with organized crime. And judges, when it came time for sentencing, were unlikely to be lenient with someone carrying that famous last name. On April 15, 2004, Peter Gotti appeared before Judge Frederick Block for sentencing. The proceedings showed just how far Peter had fallen and how badly his health had worsened, even before starting his prison sentence. Peter's lawyers submitted extensive medical records as part of their argument for a lighter sentence. The list of conditions was shocking for a 64-year-old man. Severe thyroid goiter needing medication, chronic sciatica causing constant pain, emphysema making breathing hard, rheumatoid arthritis affecting his joints, post-concussion syndrome from his decades-old garbage truck accident, still causing headaches and trouble thinking clearly, and clinical depression. He was blind in one eye from glaucoma and had limited vision in the other. He walked with difficulty and got tired easily. The defense argued that Peter was not a dangerous criminal who needed to be locked away for public safety. He was an old, sick man who had been a small figure in a dying criminal organization, someone who had never personally used violence and who posed no threat to anyone. They asked for a sentence at the lower end of the guidelines, maybe 5 to 7 years, which would let Peter serve his time and possibly return to his family while he still had some quality of life left. The prosecutors saw things very differently. Assistant U.S. Attorney Mitra Hormozi argued that Peter had been the boss of the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. Under his leadership, the family had done extortion, money laundering, and many other crimes that had hurt victims and corrupted legal industries. The fact that he was not as capable as earlier bosses did not make him less guilty or less deserving of punishment. If anything, his incompetence had made the family more reckless and dangerous because there was no strong leader to enforce order. Judge Block ultimately agreed, mostly with the prosecution. On April 15, 2004, he sentenced Peter Gotti to 9 years and 4 months in federal prison. It was a long sentence for a man of Peter's age and health, though less than the maximum he could have received. The judge acknowledged Peter's health problems, but said they could not outweigh the seriousness of his crimes and his leadership role in the Gambino family. Peter was taken into federal custody and eventually sent to the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. This was a facility that held many famous inmates and had better medical care than most federal prisons. For Peter, this was the start of what would become basically a life sentence, though neither he nor anyone else knew it at the time. But Peter's legal problems were far from over. While he was serving his sentence in Butner, federal prosecutors in New York were preparing an even more serious case against him. On December 22, 2004, just 8 months into his sentence, Peter was charged in a new indictment that made the earlier charges look almost minor. The new indictment included charges of extortion in the construction industry, where the Gambino family had long held power. But the most serious charge was conspiracy to commit murder, specifically conspiracy to murder Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, the former Gambino underboss, whose testimony had sent John Gotti to prison for life. The charges came from conversations and planning that had supposedly happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s. According to prosecutors, Peter and other Gambino leaders had discussed and planned the murder of Gambino, who was living in Arizona under federal witness protection. The killing had never been carried out. Gambino was arrested on drug charges in 2000 before the mob could get to him. But under federal law, conspiracy to commit murder is just as serious as actually doing the murder. For Peter, this new indictment was devastating. He was already serving almost a decade in prison, and now he faced the possibility of an additional life sentence. The trial for these new charges took place while Peter was still in prison. It was a strange situation where he had to be brought from Butner to New York for court hearings, then return to prison each night. The trial revealed disturbing details about the Gambino family's desire for revenge against Gambino. Witnesses testified about discussions on how to find Gambino, how to get past his federal protection, and how to carry out the hit in a way that would not bring even more police attention to the family. Some of these discussions had supposedly included Peter directly, while others had involved people under his command. Peter's defense argued that the discussions had been more fantasy than reality, the kind of tough talk that mobsters do but never seriously planned to carry out. They pointed out that no actual attempt on Gambino's life had been made. No resources had been put into the plan, and no real steps had been taken beyond talking about it. In the mob, they argued, people talk about killing their enemies all the time. That does not mean they actually intend to do it. The jury did not believe it. On July 27, 2005, Peter was convicted on the new charges, including the conspiracy to commit murder charge. 2 weeks later, on August 2, 2005, he was sentenced to an additional 25 years in federal prison to be served after his existing sentence. At 65 years old, Peter Gotti had just been given a total sentence of more than 34 years. He would be 99 years old before he would be eligible for release, an age he almost certainly would not live to see. The sentencing hearing was emotional. Peter's lawyer argued that the sentence was effectively a death sentence for a man of Peter's age and health. Peter himself spoke to the court, talking about his family, his regrets, and his belief that he was being punished not for what he had done, but for who his brother was. "I'm a Gotti," he said, and that's all they needed. But the judge was not moved. The conspiracy to commit murder charge was serious, and Gambino, however terrible his own criminal past, had been a witness in federal custody who deserved protection. Planning his murder was an attack on the justice system itself and deserved the harshest possible punishment. As if the prison sentences were not enough, 2006 brought another crushing blow to Peter. His wife Catherine filed for divorce. They had been married for 46 years. They had married in 1960 when Peter was just 21 years old. She had stayed with him through years of his double life, through his brother's legal troubles, through his own arrests and trials. But facing the reality that Peter would spend the rest of his life in prison and likely die there, Catherine made the painful choice to end their marriage. The details of the divorce were kept fairly private, but court papers showed the basic facts. Catherine mentioned the imprisonment and the impossibility of continuing the marriage under these circumstances. There was no mention of anger or specific complaints beyond the obvious. Her husband was gone, would never come back, and she needed to move on with what was left of her own life. For Peter, the divorce was perhaps more painful than the criminal convictions. He had failed as a mob boss, failed to avoid prison, failed to protect himself and his family from the results of the life he had chosen. Now he had even lost the one constant in his life. The woman who had been with him since before he joined the Gambino family, who had raised his son, who had been some connection to a normal life beyond the mob. Their son, Peter Gotti Jr., kept in touch with his father, but also had to deal with the hard reality of having a father who was serving what was basically a life sentence. Peter Jr. had mostly avoided his father's criminal lifestyle. He held legal jobs and stayed out of the newspapers, but the Gotti name remained a burden. And having a father in federal prison for mob activities carried a social shame that affected every part of his life. In prison, Peter settled into a grim routine. The Federal Correctional Complex at Butner was not the worst federal prison. It had been chosen partly because of its medical facilities and Peter's need for ongoing health care. But it was still prison, with all the indignities, limits, and dangers that came with it. Peter's health continued to get worse. His thyroid condition worsened despite medication. His emphysema made breathing harder and harder. Especially as he got older, his vision kept getting worse. The arthritis that had bothered him for years became more severe, making even simple movements painful, and perhaps worst of all, his depression deepened as the full reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. He would die in prison. He would never see his family outside of visiting rooms again. He would never have another moment of freedom. Despite being in prison and likely to stay there for life, Peter technically remained the boss of the Gambino crime family for several more years. This strange situation, a boss who was completely unable to lead because he was in prison, yet still nominally in charge, showed both the family's loyalty to the Gotti name and the lack of any strong alternative candidates for leadership. Arnold Zeke Squitieri and John Jackie Nose D'Amico, the two experienced capos who had supported Peter during his time on the streets, continued to run the family's day-to-day operations. They made the real decisions, coordinated the different crews, settled arguments, and handled the family's criminal businesses, but they did it in Peter's name, treating him as the official boss and seeking his approval for major decisions during prison visits when possible. This arrangement was getting harder and harder to maintain. Prison communications are watched and recorded, making it nearly impossible to discuss criminal activities without giving evidence to prosecutors. Visits are rare and short, hardly enough for running a complex criminal organization. Messages passed to other people are slow and can be misunderstood. For all practical purposes, the Gambino family was operating without real leadership, and everyone in the organization knew it. Law enforcement took advantage of this chaos. Throughout the mid-2000s, federal and state prosecutors continued to charge and convict Gambino family members at every level. Without strong leadership to enforce order and coordinate responses, the family's defenses were weak. Members were easier to turn into government witnesses to save themselves. Operations were sloppier, creating evidence that prosecutors could use. The family was losing members and losing power in its traditional areas. In 2008, John D'Amico was charged with racketeering and eventually convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, removing one of the main supports of Peter's leadership. Squitieri had already been sent to prison on other charges. Other capos and soldiers were being arrested regularly. The Gambino family, under Peter's in-name-only leadership, was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do about it from his prison cell in North Carolina. By 2010, the situation was impossible to continue. The family needed leadership that could actually lead, not a boss who existed only in name. There were groups within the organization pushing for change, especially the Sicilian part of the family that had always been somewhat separate from the American-born members. These Sicilians, led by Domenico Cefalu, a quiet, traditional mobster who had come to the United States from Sicily, represented a return to old-school mafia values. Low profile, high discipline, focus on making money rather than headlines. In July 2011, the official word went out. Domenico Cefalu was the new boss of the Gambino crime family. Peter Gotti, after 12 years as boss, most of them from prison, was out. The change was peaceful. No one was going to fight for Peter's right to stay boss when he was locked away for life. And by all accounts, Peter himself accepted the change with relief. He had never wanted to be boss in the first place, and the title had brought him nothing but misery. The fact that Peter had lasted 12 years as boss, even as a figurehead for most of that time, was actually remarkable in its own way. Other bosses had been pushed out much more quickly when they were imprisoned or showed weakness. That Peter kept the title for so long showed the lasting power of the Gotti name and the loyalty, however misplaced, that some family members still felt toward John Gotti's memory and family. But now it was truly over. Peter was just another federal prisoner, and the Gambino family would move on without him. As Peter entered his 70s, still in federal prison with no real hope of release, his health problems became more and more serious and harder to manage within the prison healthcare system. Federal prisons are required to give medical care to inmates, but the quality of that care varies widely, and for inmates with many ongoing health problems, the care is often not enough. Peter's thyroid goiter, which had been manageable with medication, got to the point where surgery was recommended. But getting approval for major surgery for a federal inmate is a complicated bureaucratic process, and there were long delays. In the meantime, Peter suffered from the symptoms: trouble swallowing, trouble breathing, constant discomfort. His emphysema got worse with age. This is a common progression of the disease, especially in someone who could not get proper lung care or rehabilitation. Peter found himself short of breath from the smallest effort, unable to climb stairs without resting, coughing constantly in a prison environment where showing weakness can be dangerous. These obvious signs of physical decline made him vulnerable. The rheumatoid arthritis that had bothered him for years became crippling. His hands became twisted and painful. Walking became difficult, then required a cane, then became something he avoided unless absolutely necessary. The prison could give him pain medication, but the most effective treatments for rheumatoid arthritis, regular physical therapy, occupational therapy, and certain new medications, were either not available or hard to get in the federal prison system. His vision continued to get worse. He was blind in one eye from glaucoma since his youth. Now his other eye was also developing problems. Cataracts clouded his vision. The prison could provide glasses, but they were not enough to bring his sight back to anything near normal. Peter spent his days in a gray fog, literally unable to see the world clearly, and unable to see any way out of the situation he was in. Most seriously, his depression deepened into something close to despair. Mental health care in federal prisons is known to be poor, and for a prisoner in his situation, elderly, sick, facing death in custody, there was little the system could or would do beyond giving him antidepressant pills that gave little relief. Peter had always been the quieter Gotti brother, the one who kept his feelings inside rather than expressing them. Now he pulled back even more into himself, speaking rarely, keeping minimal contact even with his family during visits and phone calls. His son, Peter Gotti Jr., watched his father's decline with increasing worry and frustration. Peter Jr. had stayed out of the criminal life, had built a legal existence for himself, but he remained devoted to his father. During prison visits, he saw a man who seemed to be giving up, who had lost the will to fight or even to survive. Peter Jr. began looking into every possible legal way to get his father released, or at least moved to a medical facility where he could get better care. In 2019, as Peter approached his 80th birthday, his family and lawyers started a formal campaign for compassionate release. This legal process allows federal prisoners who are dying or have very serious medical conditions to be released early from their sentences. It is rarely granted, especially for famous organized crime figures. But Peter's situation seemed to meet all the requirements. The First Step Act, passed by Congress in 2018, had made the reasons for compassionate release broader and somewhat easier for inmates to request it. Peter's lawyers jumped on this chance. In July 2019, they filed their first formal request for compassionate release, supported by extensive medical records. The request painted a grim picture of Peter's condition at nearly 80 years old. He was suffering from severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is COPD and emphysema, and needed extra oxygen. He had advanced thyroid disease with a large goiter blocking his airway. He was legally blind, with vision in only one eye, and that eye getting worse fast. He had severe rheumatoid arthritis that made it hard to move. He had chronic pain needing regular medication. He had clinical depression with thoughts of suicide. He had many other age-related health problems. The request argued that Peter was no danger to society. He was too old and too sick to do any criminal activity. He had no history of violence. His crimes, while serious, were not violent and had happened years ago. He had served more than 15 years of his sentence. He had family willing to take care of him. Most importantly, he was in such bad health that he would probably die within a year or two, even with good medical care, and the prison system was not set up to provide that level of care. The request was supported by letters from Peter's family, including a heartfelt letter from Peter Gotti Jr., describing watching his father get worse and begging for the chance to care for him in his final months or years. There were also letters from doctors who had examined Peter, confirming that his health was critically poor and that he needed care beyond what the Bureau of Prisons could provide. The government fought the request hard. Federal prosecutors filed a response arguing that Peter's crimes were too serious to allow early release, no matter what his health was. He had been a mob boss, had been involved in extortion and conspiracy to commit murder, and had shown no real regret for his actions. The fact that he was old and sick was unfortunate, but it did not change the nature of his crimes or justify letting him out early from a lawfully given sentence. The prosecutors also questioned some of the medical claims while admitting that Peter did have significant health problems. They argued that the Bureau of Prisons was giving him proper care and that his conditions, while serious, were not immediately life-threatening. Many elderly inmates lived with similar conditions and continued to serve their sentences. Releasing Peter would set an example that would open the door for many other elderly mobsters seeking early release. On September 12, 2019, U.S. District Judge Brian Cogan denied the request for compassionate release. In his written decision, Judge Cogan admitted Peter's serious health problems, but said they did not meet the extraordinary and compelling circumstances needed for compassionate release. The judge noted that Peter had been convicted of very serious crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder, and that public safety concerns argued against release. He also noted that Peter's projected release date of September 2031, while far in the future, was not technically a life sentence, and there was at least a theoretical chance of his eventual release. The decision was a crushing blow to Peter and his family. Peter Jr. was devastated, believing his father had been denied release, not based on the actual rules for compassionate release, but because of his last name and his connection to organized crime. "They're letting him die in prison," he told reporters. "That's what this is, a death sentence dressed up as justice, not giving up." Peter's lawyers filed a second request for compassionate release in December 2019. This request included updated medical records showing Peter's condition had gotten even worse. His COPD had gotten to the point where he was on oxygen all the time. He could move around even less. He was now in a wheelchair much of the time. He had had several serious lung infections that required hospital care. His weight had dropped to dangerously low levels. The second request also raised a new concern: COVID-19. By late 2019, news of a new virus in China was starting to spread. Though few people understood how terrible the coming pandemic would be, Peter's lawyers argued that as the virus spread, it would definitely reach U.S. prisons, and prisoners with weak lungs like Peter would be at extreme risk. His age, emphysema, and other conditions made him exactly the kind of patient who would likely die if he got COVID-19. This request also included a more detailed plan for release. Peter Jr. had arranged for his father to live with him, had gotten promises from doctors who would provide care outside the prison, had set up home health care services, and had even gotten the support of a Catholic priest who would provide spiritual care and help with Peter's move back to normal life. The request stressed that Peter would not be released to be on his own, but to a carefully set up support system that would ensure both his safety and the community's safety. Again, the government fought it. Prosecutors argued that the COVID-19 concerns, while understandable, were just guesses. The virus had not yet spread widely in the United States, and the Bureau of Prisons was taking steps to prevent it. As for Peter's worsening health, the government's position remained that he was getting proper care in prison, and that his crimes were too serious to allow early release, no matter what his medical condition was. On January 24, 2020, Judge Kogan denied the second request for compassionate release. His reasoning was similar to the first decision. While admitting Peter's serious health problems, the judge said they did not outweigh the seriousness of his crimes and the need to keep his sentence in place. The judge did note that if things changed, if Peter's health got dramatically worse, or if the COVID-19 situation became more serious, a future request might be looked at more favorably. But for now, the answer was no. The denial came just weeks before COVID-19 started spreading widely across the United States. By March 2020, the pandemic that Peter's lawyers had warned about was real. Prisons became hotspots for infection. Inmates with weak lungs, like Peter, were dying at alarming rates. The Federal Bureau of Prisons would eventually lose more than 250 inmates to COVID-19. With thousands more infected, Peter managed to avoid infection through the first waves of the pandemic, likely because his age and health conditions kept him isolated from much of the general prison population. But he spent the last year of his life in even more restricted conditions than before. With prison lockdowns limiting movement, visits stopped entirely, and phone calls becoming his only contact with the outside world. On Thursday, February 25, 2021, at about 9:47 in the morning, Peter Arthur Gotti died in the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. He was 81 years old. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but given his many serious health problems, finding one single cause was hard. His emphysema, heart disease, kidney failure, and other conditions had basically come together to cause his whole system to fail. He died alone in the sense that no family members were there. Federal prison rules, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, made deathbed visits extremely hard to arrange and often impossible. Peter Jr. was told about his father's death by phone from prison officials. He immediately made plans to travel to North Carolina to pick up his father's body, starting the painful process of planning a funeral and finding a final resting place for a man who had lived such a complicated and controversial life. The news of Peter Gotti's death was reported in major news outlets, but the coverage was small compared to the huge amount of reporting that had followed his brother John's death in 2002. The New York Times ran a short obituary. The New York Post did a longer piece, but it focused more on repeating Peter's criminal history and his dumbest Don nickname than on his life or what he left behind. Court TV, which had covered his trials extensively, did a short review segment, but there were no special reports, no deep analysis of what his death meant for organized crime or for the Gotti family legacy. This quiet response showed both how far the goddess had fallen and how much the public's interest in traditional organized crime had faded. In the 1990s, John Gotti had been one of the most famous people in America, a criminal whose every move was covered by the media. By 2021, organized crime, while still existing, had mostly faded from public view. The mob had been replaced in the public's imagination by drug cartels, international terrorism, and computer crime. The traditional Italian-American mafia seemed like something from a different time, almost old-fashioned with its codes and structures. Peter was buried in a private ceremony attended only by close family members. There was no mob funeral, no line of gangsters paying their respects, none of the ceremony that had gone with John Gotti's funeral. Peter Jr. made the choice to keep everything quiet, partly out of respect for his father's wish for privacy, and partly to avoid attracting unwanted media attention. Peter was laid to rest in a cemetery in Queens, not far from where he had grown up and spent most of his life. His gravestone was simple, showing just his name and dates, nothing mentioning his role in the Gambino family or his years as boss. In the days after Peter's death, Peter Jr. gave one interview to a local newspaper. He was asked whether he was angry at the federal government for denying his father's requests for compassionate release, basically letting him die in prison. "Angry doesn't begin to cover it," he said, "but I'm also at peace. My father is finally at peace. He's not in pain anymore. He's not in that cell anymore. Whatever you think about what he did in his life, nobody deserves to die the way he did, old, sick, alone, in a prison cell." Asked what he wanted people to remember about his father, Peter Jr. paused for a long time before answering. "He was loyal," he finally said. "That was his greatest quality and maybe his fatal flaw. He was loyal to his brother, loyal to his family, loyal to people who didn't deserve his loyalty. He spent his whole life doing what other people expected of him, trying to be what other people wanted him to be. And in the end, that's what killed him. Not the prison, not the prosecutors, but trying to be something he never was and could never be." When Peter Gotti died in 2021, the Gambino crime family kept going, but in a form that would have been almost unrecognizable to its founders or to its leaders during its peak, like Carlo Gambino or John Gotti. The organization that had once controlled whole industries and affected politics across New York was now a shadow of its former self. It ran small-time criminal operations and struggled to keep even a part of its old power. Domenico Scefalu, who had replaced Peter as boss in 2011, had himself stepped down by the time of Peter's death. He was replaced by Lorenzo Mannino. The change in leadership showed both the old age of the family's leaders. Shafalu was in his 70s when he stepped down, and the difficulty of keeping control while under constant police pressure. Manino was reportedly a capable, if low-key leader, but he was leading an organization that looked nothing like the Gambino family of earlier years. The family's old power bases had been mostly taken apart. The waterfront operations that had made millions in the 1970s and 1980s were gone. They had been broken up by a mix of federal prosecutions and honest union reform. The construction industry rackets that had been another big money source were reduced. There were fewer chances for the kind of widespread corruption that had once existed. The gambling and loan sharking operations continued, but on a much smaller scale, and they faced competition from legal gambling operations and legal financial services. Most importantly, the code of silence that had once been the Mafia's greatest protection had basically collapsed. The success of federal witness protection programs and the harshness of reho sentences had convinced many mobsters that helping the police was better than life in prison. Each cooperating witness gave information that led to more arrests, which produced more cooperating witnesses, creating a cycle that destroyed the organization. By 2021, it was thought that the Gambino family had maybe 200 active members, down from over 300 at its peak. And many of those were old men holding on to past glories rather than active criminals. The Gotti name, once meaning power in organized crime, had become something of a curse. No one wanted to be connected to the level of attention and police scrutiny that name brought. Peter's son, Peter Jr., had purposely stayed out of the life, and the few other Gotti family members who stayed in the mob kept very quiet profiles. The time of the celebrity gangster, which John Gotti had come to represent, was definitely over. To understand Peter Gotti, we must look past the dumbest Don nickname and the jokes, past the criminal convictions and the years in prison, to examine the man himself and the impossible situation he was placed in. Was Peter really stupid, or was he just not right for the role he was forced to play? The evidence suggests the second option. Peter was, by most accounts, good at the tasks he chose to do. He kept a legal job as a sanitation worker for almost 20 years. Not a job that needs genius, but one that needs reliability, responsibility, and the ability to follow rules. His bosses during those years had no major complaints about his work. He managed his personal money okay, kept a stable marriage for over 40 years, and raised a son who stayed out of serious trouble. These are not the achievements of someone who truly lacks intelligence. In his criminal career, Peter was similarly good within his chosen area. As an associate and later as a soldier, he could be counted on. He followed orders, kept secrets, and handled the jobs given to him without major failures. As a capo managing a small crew, he apparently did okay work. There are no reports of his crew falling apart or of members complaining about his leadership at that level. He understood the mob's culture, its codes, and its expectations. He got through the complex social situations of organized crime for years without getting killed, which requires a certain level of street smarts and social intelligence. What Peter lacked was not intelligence in any general way. What he lacked were the specific qualities needed to be the boss of a major criminal organization in the early 21st century. Strategic vision, a commanding presence, ruthlessness, the ability to make people fear and respect him at the same time, and the political skills to manage a large, divided organization under intense outside pressure. These are special leadership qualities that many intelligent, capable people do not have. A brilliant engineer might make a terrible CEO. A gifted teacher might fail as a principal. Peter Gotti was a good soldier and a decent capo. But he had no business being boss, and on some level, he knew it. The tragedy is that he was pushed into the role anyway, not through his own wanting it, but through family loyalty and John Gotti's determination to keep control even from prison. Think about a different path. If Peter had stayed a sanitation worker his whole life, he would have retired with a pension at about age 55. He would have been a working-class retiree, maybe playing cards in the park, spending time with his grandchildren, enjoying whatever simple pleasures his pension and Social Security could provide. He would have died at home surrounded by family, remembered as a decent man who worked hard and provided for his family. That life was completely within his reach. Or think about a smaller criminal career. If Peter had stayed a soldier, or even a capo, never moving up to boss, he probably would have avoided the level of attention that led to his long imprisonment. He might have served some time for minor charges, many mobsters do, but he would not have been the main target of major federal investigations. He might have grown old in his own bed rather than dying in a prison cell. But Peter's loyalty to his brother, to his family, to the code of organized crime, stopped him from taking either of these paths. When John needed him to be boss, Peter accepted the role despite his own doubts. When the police came after him, Peter did not help them or testify to save himself, even though he must have known that helping them might have led to a lighter sentence. He lived by the code he had committed to, and he died by it. There is something admirable in that kind of loyalty, even if it is loyalty to something ultimately destructive. Peter Gotti was, in his own way, a man of principle. His principles were mob principles. Loyalty above all. Never help the police. Keep your promises even when they hurt you. But he held to them always. In a time when many mobsters were turning against each other, when the code of silence had become more of a suggestion than a rule, Peter stayed committed. It took a kind of courage, even if it was courage in service of a criminal group. Let us count the price Peter Gotti paid for his loyalty and his life in organized crime. The numbers are huge and sobering. Peter became connected to the Gambino family in 1960 at age 21. He died in federal prison in 2021 at age 81. That is 61 years connected to organized crime, more than 3/4 of his life. Basically his whole adult life, of those 61 years. He spent the last 19 years in federal prison. He was arrested in 2002 and never saw freedom again. He missed 19 years of life with his family. 19 years of holidays and birthdays and ordinary moments. His grandchildren, if he had any, grew up barely knowing him. His son became a middle-aged man with his father only reachable through prison visits and watched phone calls. His marriage of 46 years ended in divorce because of his imprisonment. Catherine Gotti, who had stayed with Peter through years of his criminal career, finally had to admit that there was no point in staying married to a man she would never live with again. Whatever love or commitment had kept their marriage going for nearly half a century could not survive the reality of life imprisonment. His health was destroyed, while some of his medical conditions might have happened anyway, regardless of his lifestyle, like the glaucoma that blinded one eye and some of the arthritis. Others were directly or indirectly related to his life in crime, the stress of constant police surveillance, the inability to get proper health care because he was running from the law at various points, the conditions of imprisonment in his final years, and the depression that came from seeing his life's work fall apart around him, all took their toll. He died at 81, but the quality of his final years was so poor that death might have come as a relief. Money-wise, the calculation is almost impossible, but clearly negative. Peter earned money through legal work for 19 years. Building up a pension, he earned money through criminal activities for years. But he also spent huge amounts on legal fees, lost all his things to government seizure, left his family with no financial support during his imprisonment, and died with basically nothing. Whatever wealth he gathered during his criminal career was wiped out, many times over by the costs of defending himself and the government's successful efforts to take things bought with illegal money. Most importantly, Peter paid with his reputation and what he left behind. He is remembered, to the extent he is remembered at all, as the dumbest un, a figure of mockery, a joke, an example of what not to do. This reputation was unfair in many ways, but it is the one that stuck. When people talk about Peter Gotti, it is not with the grudging respect sometimes given to successful criminals, but with scorn and pity. He lived in John's shadow and died in it. Compare what Peter paid to what he got. What did organized crime give him for most of his criminal career? It gave him extra money while he worked a legal job. Nice, but hardly life-changing. For a few years as a captain, it gave him status within a criminal group and probably decent money, though not enough to make him wealthy. For 12 years, it gave him the title of boss of the Gambino family, a title that brought him nothing but misery, imprisonment, and historical shame against this. What he gave up was his freedom for the last 19 years of his life, his marriage, his health, his relationship with his son, any chance of a peaceful old age, and his reputation. The calculation is not even close. Peter Gotti got a terrible deal from the mob life. Probably one of the worst deals of any major organized crime figure in American history. What can we learn from Peter Gotti's life? What does his story teach us about loyalty, family, crime, and the American dream gone wrong? First, it teaches us about the danger of living to meet other people's expectations instead of being true to yourself. Peter spent his whole adult life trying to be what his family needed him to be. A loyal brother, a reliable mob associate, a good capo, and finally a boss. But he was never asked what he wanted to be. And he apparently never asked himself. The one time we know he resisted a role. When John wanted to make him boss, he was overruled. And he accepted being overruled without real resistance. How many of us do the same thing in less dramatic ways? We follow careers that our parents want for us, or that society values instead of careers that match our real interests and abilities. We stay in relationships that do not work because we feel we should. We take on responsibilities we are not right for because we cannot say no to family or friends. Peter's story is an extreme version of a common human problem. The inability to set limits and honor your own limits. Second, Peter's story teaches us about the myth of honor and loyalty in organized crime. The mob sells itself both to its members and to the public through movies and TV shows as a group built on honor, respect, and loyalty. Men are told that if they follow the rules, keep their promises, and stay loyal, they will be taken care of. The family looks after its own. Blood is thicker than water. Peter believed this. He stayed loyal to his brother, to the family, to the code. And what did that loyalty get him? When he was arrested, the family gave little help. When he went to trial, there were no big fundraising efforts. When he was convicted, no one organized to help his wife and son. When he asked for compassionate release in his final years, no powerful mob figure spoke up for him. He died alone in prison, abandoned by the organization he had given up everything for. The truth is that mob loyalty mostly flows upward. Soldiers are expected to be loyal to capos, capos to bosses. But when a soldier or capo gets in trouble, They are often left to handle it themselves. The organization's first concern is protecting itself, not protecting individual members. This is true in most structured groups, criminal or otherwise. But the mob's stories of honor and loyalty make the betrayal especially stark. Third, Peter's story teaches us about the changing nature of American organized crime and law, enforcement's growing skill in fighting it. The mob that Peter joined in 1960 was powerful, wealthy, and fairly safe from serious police action. Local police were often corrupt. Federal law enforcement had few tools to fight organized crime, and the code of silence was strong enough that prosecutions were hard. By the time Peter became boss in 1999, everything had changed. RICO laws gave prosecutors powerful weapons. Electronic surveillance was advanced and widespread. The Witness Protection Program had convinced many mobsters to help the police. Federal law enforcement made destroying organized crime a top goal, and younger generations of criminals were less committed to old codes of silence. Peter became boss at exactly the wrong time. A more skilled leader might have handled these challenges better. But even John Gotti, in his prime, could not have succeeded in the environment Peter faced. The golden age of American organized crime was over, and Peter was left holding a crown that had lost all its value forth. Peter's story teaches us about the American criminal justice system's approach to organized crime. The long sentences given to Peter, 34+ years total, were designed not just to punish him, but to destroy the organization he represented. Federal prosecutors wanted to send a message. If you join the mob, if you move up through its ranks, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. There will be no retirement, no peaceful old age, no story of making things right. This approach has been effective in taking apart traditional organized crime, but it raises questions about fairness and mercy. Peter's crimes were serious: extortion, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder. But he never personally killed anyone or used violence. He was in many ways a low-level participant in a criminal organization who happened to hold a high title. Did he deserve to die in prison? The court said yes, but reasonable people might disagree. The denial of Peter's requests for compassionate release is especially troubling. He was 80 years old, blind, suffering from many serious illnesses, and clearly no danger to society. Releasing him would not have undone his crimes or changed his guilt. It would simply have let him die at home rather than in a prison cell. The choice to deny his requests suggests that for certain kinds of criminals, especially organized crime figures, no amount of age, illness, or change will ever be enough to deserve mercy. When Peter Gotti died in February 2021, he was the last of the Gotti brothers who had controlled the Gambino family in the late 20th century. John had died in 2002. Jean had died in 2018, also in federal prison. Richard had died in 2020. Just before Peter, Vincent, the youngest brother, had died in 1980, years before the others. The Gotti generation was gone. What did they leave behind? John Gotti left behind a legacy of shame and warning. He is remembered as a charming, violent criminal whose need for attention and fame ultimately brought down not just himself, but his whole organization. His story has been told in countless books, documentaries, and movies, but not as a story of success. As a story of pride and destruction, Peter's legacy is even less flattering. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as the dumbest Don, a man who never should have been boss, who proved how important skilled leadership is, even in criminal groups. His story is used to show what happens when loyalty and family ties replace skill in choosing leaders. The larger Gotti family legacy is one of destruction. Many family members served prison time. Marriages were broken. Children grew up with fathers in prison or gone. The family name, once a source of pride in their neighborhood, became a burden. Young men with the Gotti last name found themselves under automatic suspicion, their lives shadowed by their relatives' choices. John Gotti Jr., who had served as acting boss before Peter, eventually made a public show of leaving the life, saying he had quit the mob and wanted to leave legally. Whether this was real or a strategy is debated, but it was an admission that the Gotti name in organized crime had become more of a problem than an advantage. Peter Gotti Jr. went further, purposely staying out of the life entirely and building a legal existence separate from his family's criminal past. The Gambino family itself continues to exist, but looks nothing like the organization that the goddess once controlled. It is smaller, weaker, less organized, and less profitable. It survives more through laziness and the few criminal chances that still exist than through any organizational strength. The family that was once considered one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world is now a small player in New York's criminal world, overshadowed by newer and more flexible criminal groups. From a certain view, the Gotti time represents the end of traditional American organized crime. The Italian-American Mafia, which had controlled organized crime in the United States from the 1920s through the 1980s, was effectively destroyed by federal prosecutions in the 1990s and 2000s. The goddess, especially John and Peter, were symbols of that destruction, powerful at their peak, but finally unable to adapt to changing conditions, brought down by their own pride, incompetence, and the constant pressure of law enforcement. Beyond the crime numbers, court records, and analysis of the organization, Peter Gotti's story is finally a human story about a man trapped by circumstances, loyalty, and his own limits. Let us think about the human cost, not just to Peter himself, but to everyone his life touched. Catherine, who spent 46 years married to a man who lived a double life, who was absent even when he was there, who finally left her alone to take care of herself when he was imprisoned. She was hurt by Peter's choices, her life shaped by decisions she did not make and could not control. What might her life have been if she had married a different man? Someone who worked his sanitation route and came home to her every night. We will never know, but it is hard not to see her as a victim. However much she might have helped Peter's criminal career, Peter Gotti Jr. grew up as the son of a mobster, carrying a famous and shameful last name, trying to build a legal life while his father and uncle made news for their crimes. He loved his father. That is clear from his efforts to get Peter released and from his public statements after Peter's death. But that love must have been mixed with anger, disappointment, and questions about what might have been if his father had made different choices. Peter Jr., as children, if he has any, are the third generation affected by decisions made years before they were born. The victims of the Gambino family's crimes deserve mention too. Steven Seagal, for all his Hollywood privilege and his own questionable behavior, lived in real fear after being shaken down and paid $700,000 he should not have had to pay. The construction workers and business owners who pay protection money or higher prices because of mob control of industries. The families of men who were killed or imprisoned because of the mob's activities. Peter may not have personally used violence, but he gained from an organization built on violence and fear. The police officers who spent careers fighting organized crime also paid a price. Agents worked thousands of hours investigating the Gambino family. Prosecutors spent years building cases. Judges spent weeks or months running trials. All of this was necessary work, But it was work that would not have been needed if men like Peter Gotti had chosen legal lives. The public money spent on investigating, prosecuting, and imprisoning the goddess and their associates could have been used for education, health care, roads, or countless other good purposes. Even other mobsters paid a price for Peter's leadership. The members of the Gambino family who followed Peter's orders or accepted his leadership found themselves under more police attention. Many were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned during Peter's time as boss. Some helped the police and entered witness protection, permanently cut off from their families and communities. Others stayed loyal and went to prison, where many remain today. While these men made their own choices to join and stay in organized crime, Peter's poor leadership probably put them at greater risk than a more skilled boss might have. It is worth thinking about what might have happened if Peter Gotti had made different choices at key moments in his life. These other possible paths are just guesses, but they help show the actual choices Peter made and their results. Imagine that in 1960, when Peter married Catherine, he decided to commit completely to his legal career with the sanitation department. He works his route, earns his paycheck, stays completely away from his brother's criminal activities. He is present at family gatherings, but he makes it clear he is not interested in mob business. Some family members might make fun of him, but over time, they accept that Peter is the one brother who went straight in this other timeline. Peter retires from the sanitation department in 1994 with full pension at age 55. He and Catherine move to a smaller place, maybe Florida or somewhere else warm. They have grandchildren who visit often. Peter spends his retirement years gardening, watching sports, maybe doing some part-time work to add to his pension. He lives to see 81, but those final years are spent at home. Dying peacefully in his own bed with his wife and son there, he is buried with a simple headstone, remembered as a working-class guy who provided for his family and lived a quiet, decent life. Would this have been possible? Probably, though it would have required Peter to resist huge family pressure. The mob values family loyalty above almost everything else, and refusing to help your brothers would have been seen as a betrayal. But other men have done it. There are brothers and sons of mobsters who have chosen legal lives. It would have been hard, but it was possible. Imagine that Peter enters the mob life as he actually did, but refuses to be promoted beyond soldier, or at most a capo with a small crew. When John wants to make him boss in 1999, Peter absolutely refuses. Get someone else, he tells his brother. I'm not qualified and I won't do it. John might be angry, but eventually he accepts it and picks someone else. In this timeline, Peter serves some prison time, maybe 2 to 5 years on minor charges, but he is not the main target of major federal investigations. He gets out of prison in his late 50s or early 60s, lives quietly in Brooklyn, and eventually dies at home. He is known as John Gotti's brother, yes, but he is not famous in his own right. His obituary is a few paragraphs in a local paper. Nothing more. This too would have been possible, but it would have required Peter to stand up to his brother and family in a way he apparently could not do. The one time we know Peter resisted his appointment as boss, he was overruled and did not push back. A different personality, someone more assertive, more willing to set limits, might have made this choice. But Peter was not that person. Imagine that when Peter is arrested in 2002, facing serious charges, he makes a different calculation. He is 62 years old. His brother just died, and he is looking at the rest of his life in prison. He decides to help the police, providing information about the Gambino family in exchange for a reduced sentence. In this timeline, Peter testifies in many trials, helps prosecutors understand the family structure and operations, and enters witness protection. He serves maybe 5 years in prison, then is released under a new identity. He lives out his days in some unknown suburb, his son able to visit him sometimes under controlled conditions. He dies at 81, but as a free man, though one cut off from his history and identity. This would have been the smart choice from a purely self-interested view, but it would have required Peter to break everything he had been taught about loyalty and the code of silence. It would have meant admitting that his whole adult life had been a mistake. For someone of Peter's generation and background, this was apparently unthinkable. He would rather die in prison than become a traitor. Whether that choice was admirable or foolish depends on your view. But it was true to who Peter was. Peter Gotti's story does not stand alone. It is part of a larger story about the rise and fall of organized crime in America, about Italian-American identity and fitting in, about law enforcement's growing abilities, and about the American criminal justice system's approach to punishment and making things right. The Italian-American Mafia rose to power in the early 1900s, filling a need created by prohibition and the demand for illegal alcohol. The groups that started as bootlegging operations grew into skilled criminal organizations controlling gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and many other illegal and partly legal activities. For Italian immigrants and their children, who often faced unfair treatment in legal society, the mob offered a path to wealth, power, and respect that was not available through normal ways. By the middle of the century, when Peter was growing up, the mob had become a set part of certain Italian-American neighborhoods. It was not hidden or secret. Everyone knew who the mobsters were, which social clubs they ran from, and what businesses they controlled. There was often an uneasy mix of legal and illegal economies, with the mob providing certain services: protection, dispute solving, informal banking, that filled gaps in the formal economy for young men like Peter growing up in these neighborhoods. The mob was not some outside force. It was woven into everyday life. Mobsters were neighbors, relatives, and community leaders. They provided jobs, settled arguments, and helped people in need while also taking money through fear, scaring people, and sometimes killing those who stood against them. The choice to join the mob was not necessarily seen as a choice to become a criminal. It was sometimes seen as joining a different power structure that operated by different rules than normal society. But by the 1980s and 1990s, this world was disappearing. Federal RICO laws, aggressive prosecutions, electronic surveillance, and the witness protection program were taking apart the mob's power. Younger Italian Americans were fitting into mainstream society, going to college, entering professions, and having less connection to the old neighborhood structures. The economic gaps that the mob had filled were being filled by legal options: legal gambling, legal lending, formal systems for solving disputes. Peter Gotti became boss, just as this old world was finally dying. He was trying to lead a group that was already out of date, fighting battles that had already been lost, following codes that no one else still believed in. His failure was not just personal. It was generational and structural. The mob that Carlo Gambino had led in the 1960s and 1970s could not exist in the early 21st century, and no amount of skilled leadership could change that basic truth. From this view, Peter's story is almost like a Greek tragedy. He was meant to fail not because of his personal limits, but because he was asked to do something impossible, to keep and lead a group whose time had passed. A more skilled person might have failed more slowly or with more dignity, but they would have failed anyway. Peter's lack of skill was not the cause of the Gambino family's fall. It was just one factor in a fall that could not be stopped. One of the saddest parts of Peter Gotti's story is the lack of any story of making things right. In popular culture, we love stories of criminals who see the error of their ways, change themselves, and finally find a way to make things right. These stories appeal to our belief in people's ability to change and our wish for justice to include chances for transformation. Peter never had that chance. He was arrested at 62, convicted at 63 and 65, and spent the last 19 years of his life in prison. During those years, there is no sign that he gave up his mob connections, testified against former associates, or publicly said he was sorry for his crimes. He kept his loyalty to the code until the end. Could he have made things right if he had been released? We will never know. Peter's requests for compassionate release were based on his medical conditions, not on any change in his character or rejection of his past. If he had been released, he probably would have returned to his son's home and spent his final months or years as an elderly, sick retiree, whether he would have used that time to think about his life, express regret, or try to make amends with anyone he had hurt is unknown. The federal criminal justice system does not focus on making things right, especially for organized crime figures. The long mandatory minimum sentences, the difficulty of getting early release, and the denial of compassionate release even for the elderly and sick, all show a belief that some crimes are so serious that the people who did them give up any right to make things right. They must serve their full sentences no matter their age, health, or signs of change. This approach satisfies a certain sense of justice and stopping others from doing the same, but it closes off chances for human growth and change. Peter Gotti at 81 was not the same person he had been at 40 or 50. Age, illness, imprisonment, loss of family, and the passing of time all change people. The man who died in Butner in 2021 had spent 19 years away from criminal activity, under the harsh discipline and limits of federal prison. In what real way was he still the dangerous criminal who needed to be locked up? The argument against this, of course, is that Peter had chances to change his path long before he was imprisoned. He could have chosen a legal life at 21. He could have refused to be made at 49. He could have refused the boss position at 59. He could have helped the police at 62. At each of these moments, he chose loyalty to the mob over other options. Having made those choices over and over throughout his life, why should he be shown mercy in his final years? This is a real conflict of ideas without easy answers. The criminal justice system must balance punishment, stopping others, keeping dangerous people off the streets, and helping people change. For someone like Peter Gotti, the system decided that punishment and stopping others were more important than any claims for mercy or change. Whether that decision was right is something each person must decide for themselves. Peter Arthur Gotti's life was defined by shadows and absences. He lived in the shadow of his famous brother. He rose to a position of power, but had little real control. He held the title of boss, but was mocked as the dumbest Don. He married, but his wife finally left him. He had a son, but was gone for much of his son's life. He got criminal convictions, but said he was unfairly targeted for his name rather than his actions. He spent his final years in prison, surrounded by other inmates. But dying alone, what was Peter Gotti? Not the brilliant criminal mastermind that his brother was said to be. Not the violent enforcer that many mobsters were. Not the smart businessman that some mafia leaders became. He was perhaps the most ordinary man to ever lead a major American crime family. And that ordinariness was exactly what destroyed him. In trying to sum up Peter's life and what he left behind, we are left with uncomfortable questions more than comfortable answers. Was Peter a victim? In some ways, yes, a victim of family expectations, of things beyond his control, of being pushed into a role he never wanted and could not fill well. But he was also a willing participant in organized crime for 60 years. Someone who gained from illegal activities and chose not to leave even when he could have. Was Peter stupid? The evidence suggests no. He was a man of average intelligence who lacked specific leadership qualities needed for a particular role. The Dumbest Don nickname was mean and wrong, but it stuck because it caught something real. Peter's unsuitability for the position he held. Was Peter's loyalty admirable? It was consistent, certainly, and it cost him everything. He stayed loyal to his brother, his family, and the mob code, even when that loyalty served no purpose and brought him no benefit. Whether that makes it admirable or tragic is a matter of view. Did Peter deserve his fate? He committed serious crimes: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder. He received serious punishment, effectively life imprisonment ending in death behind bars. Whether the crime fit the punishment is debatable, but by the standards of federal law, justice was served. What should we remember about Peter Gotti? Maybe this: he was a human being who made choices, both forced and free, that led him down a path ending in loss, regret, and lonely death. He was neither the monster some painted him as nor the innocent victim others might claim. He was a complicated, flawed man who lived in impossible circumstances and failed to rise above them. His story serves as a warning about the costs of blind loyalty, about the dangers of trying to be someone you are not, about how crime really does not pay, despite what the stories suggest. But it is also a story that brings some sympathy for the man who never wanted to be boss, but became one anyway, who tried to meet others' expectations and lost himself in the process, who stayed loyal when everyone else was making deals, who died blind, sick, and alone in a prison cell while the world moved on without him. On February 25, 2021, when Peter Gotti took his last breath in that North Carolina prison cell, an era truly ended. He was the last of the Gotti brothers, the last link to a time when the mob still seemed powerful and when the Gotti name still meant something. With his death, that chapter of American organized crime history closed for good. His gravestone in Queens bears only his name and dates. It does not mention that he was once boss of the Gambino crime family. It does not include the insulting Dumbest Don nickname. It does not sum up his crimes or his convictions. It is just a marker showing that a man named Peter Gotti was born in 1939 and died in 2021, that he existed and now does not, that he was here and now is gone. Maybe that simple anonymity is what Peter would have wanted all along. To be just a name on a stone, not a boss or a don or a criminal, just a man who lived and died like millions of others. But history, for better or worse, will remember him differently. As the Dumbest Don, as the man who proved that blood is not always thicker than water, as the ultimate example of how not to run a criminal organization, as a warning about loyalty taken too far in the end. Peter Gotti's greatest tragedy was not that he was stupid. He was not. It was not even that he failed as a mob boss. The role was impossible given the circumstances. His greatest tragedy was that he spent 81 years on Earth and never found out who Peter Gotti actually was beneath the expectations, the titles, and the names. He was always someone's brother, someone's associate, someone's boss, someone's prisoner. But who was he really? We will never know, and maybe neither did he. The story of Peter Gotti. The dumbest Don is complete. The man is dead. The organization he led is in its final decline. The time he represented is over. All that is left are the records, the court transcripts, the surveillance photos, the newspaper articles, the memories of those who knew him, and the lessons we can take from a life lived in shadows, ending in darkness. His last words, if he had any, were not recorded. His final thoughts remain unknown. He simply stopped breathing one Thursday morning in late February, and the world continued on without him, barely noticing his passing. For a man who once controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America, who had a famous name and a position of respect, however mocked, who affected countless lives through his choices and actions. That quiet, unnoticed ending seems almost impossibly sad. But maybe it is fitting. Peter Gotti was never meant to be noticed. He was meant to be in the background, following orders, doing his job, staying loyal. Fame and attention found him against his will, and they destroyed him in death. He finally returns to the anonymity he should have kept in life. Just another name, just another grave, just another warning about the price of loyalty and the cost of living someone else's life. And that ends the sad story of Peter Gotti, a man who never wanted to be boss, but died a prisoner of that very title. His life reminds us that sometimes the heaviest chains are the ones made by family loyalty and the weight of expectations we can never meet. I hope this story helped you relax, gave you something to think about, or helped you drift off to sleep. If you liked this deep look into a life, please show your support by hitting that like button. It really helps us make more stories like this. Do not forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next Sleepy Gangster story. We have so many amazing true crime tales coming up. From the golden age of American gangsters to international crime groups, from brilliant robberies to huge failures. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought of Peter Gotti's story. Do you think he was really the dumbest Don, or was he just a man in an impossible situation? And what mob story should we cover next? Your ideas help us choose our next deep look if you are still awake. Check out our playlist for more Sleepy Gangster stories. And if you are already drifting off, sweet dreams. And I will see you in the next story. Until next time. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, not all things left behind are worth keeping. Good night.